website looks like right now. And I am going to go back to the slides. And we are going to move on to CSS. So if it feels like we're moving really quickly, we are. This is a lot to learn in one night, but please keep in mind this is just an introductory class. This is just an intro to coding. If you want to learn more about coding on your own or this moves too quickly for you, one, I would say take this class again. We offer it all the time, multiple times a week. And there is a ton of information out there to self-learn if you want to spend a little bit more time on this, going a little bit slower at your own pace. So don't feel overwhelmed. Okay, so by now you guys probably have a good idea of what CSS does. It controls the display of a web page. This includes text and background colors, font size, any other cosmetic aspects, and something very important that we won't get too much into today, but that is probably one of the most important pieces of CSS is fitting different screen dimensions. So you are all probably familiar with websites that work great on your desktop, and then when you go to that same website on your phone, it looks horrible and it barely works. That is because they are not using CSS to accurately tailor their website to a mobile version. Again, we're not going to get too much into that today, but I think that's a kind of a fun little tidbit of information about what CSS is really capable of. It's very robust. CSS is the design aspect of HTML's content. So you cannot have CSS without HTML because there would be nothing to format. If you were going back to thinking about this Word document that we're working on in theory, if you didn't have any content on your Word document, there would be nothing to style. So you wouldn't add a highlight text, you wouldn't change font size, you wouldn't change the font family because there's nothing to change. So if you have a CSS file without an HTML file, it doesn't work at all. You can only use CSS with HTML. So CSS might look a little bit overwhelming. Don't get overwhelmed yet. This is what a CSS rule looks like. So the first thing you have is your selector. This should look familiar. This H1 is our largest heading option. And then we have two curly braces. This is an opening curly brace and a closing curly brace. Inside of there, we have a declaration, and a declaration consists of a property and a value. So the first thing you are going to see is this property of color and value of orange. And then we also have another declaration inside of our rule, which is text align center. So just like it sounds, something that's really nice for beginners when it comes to CSS is that the properties and values in CSS sound exactly like they should and explain exactly what they do. So we are selecting our largest heading element, and then we are giving it an orange color, and we are aligning all of our content in the center. So by default, it's always going to be aligned on the left, just like in a Word document. You can also right align it or center align it. So a selector with no punctuation selects an HTML tag. Just like we saw on that previous page, H1 is going to select that H1 heading. And it's also going to select all H1 headings. So if we have multiple H1s on our page, it's going to select all of them. A selector beginning with a period will select a class. So remember that class attribute. Thinking back to the difference between classes and IDs, you can have a classroom full of people with unique IDs, but all of those unique IDs can be grouped together under one class. And a selector beginning with the pound symbol selects an ID. So classes are periods, IDs are pound symbols, and this is how we select them in our CSS. The CSS box model is the kind of foundation of how everything in HTML fits inside of each other and in relation to each other. So this is what the box model looks like in theory. It might sound like some big philosophical thing, but it's really not at all. All that the box model says is that every single piece of content on your website is a box. Even if it's a circle, it's a box. So content is what's inside of the element. That's right here. Border is the line around your element, and it can be invisible. You don't have to have a visible border. Margin is the space outside the border between this element and its neighbor, and padding is the space inside the borders surrounding the content. So I always describe the box model as a package that you receive on your doorstep. So UPS or FedEx or Amazon or USPS come and deliver you a box, and it's sitting on your doorstep. The actual thing that you ordered, whether it's a cell phone case or, in my situation, a brand new cell phone because you dropped your old one on the pavement and it shattered, that is the content. That is your element. That is what's inside of your box. The stuff that's actually surrounding your new purchase, so in my case, my new cell phone that I just bought because I shattered my old one, that is the padding. So whether it is packing peanuts, which thankfully nobody really uses anymore, it might be just the box that the element comes in, it might be some of that plastic filled with air, it might be pieces of paper, that is your padding right here, this piece of teal. And then the box itself is your border. So you've got your element, which is your content, you've got your padding, and then you have your border, which is the actual box itself. Everything outside of that box, your doorstep, the air around it, your front door, your patio, that is margin. So that's everything outside of your box. All right, we are going to move on to our CSS and start styling our website. So I'm going to close our index.html file, and I'll give you guys just a second to get back to CodePen. So again, we are in codepen.io. We're working in that project that you guys fort.
I also just want to say that if anyone has questions, to continue posting them in the chat. I also started a Google Doc with screenshots of how to fork a project and the code of adding those images as that source attribute.
Thank you, Jessa. Yes, please, if you have questions, feel free to drop it in the chat and we will address all of them as we get them. All right, so next we are going to work on our CSS. Open up that styles.css document. And you will notice right here, we have some more comments. These comments look a little bit different. That is just because comments in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are formatted just a little bit differently, but that doesn't mean they don't do exactly the same thing. So under here, we are going to start adding our body. Recall that when we are selecting an element, we just write the element name. So we're just going to write body. The reason we are not using a period or that pound symbol is because we're just selecting the element by its name. We're not selecting it by its class or ID. The next thing you're going to do is add those opening and closing curly braces. Usually, when you are using a code editor, it's going to do that closing curly brace for you just because there's always going to be an opening and a closing one. But make sure that you do have both of them. So we have opening and closing. I just hit enter a couple times so that I have room to add our rules. The first declaration that we are going to add is our font family. So you'll notice right now, if you know anything about fonts, this font is called a serif font. That just means that there are little lines on the tops and bottom pieces of your code. So we are going to change this from a serif font to a sans serif font. Sans serif means that there are no lines on your texts or on your letters. Serif fonts are the default for all HTML pages. So we are going to write font dash family. Recall that I said CSS is great because it makes sense in English when you read this out loud. So when we add a font family property, it's going to actually change the font family. It's going to do exactly what it sounds like. And then we're going to add a colon. We always separate our properties and values with a colon. Next, we are going to add 3 fonts: Arial, Helvetica, and sans-serif. And then we're going to end our declaration with a semicolon. You'll notice we have 3 fonts right here. The first font is Arial. This is the first font that we want it to use. If Arial is not available, we want our browser to use Helvetica. And if neither of these fonts are available, we want our browser to use the first available sans-serif font. Something that can be a little overwhelming for people who are just starting to code is, how do I know what to code? You do not need to memorize this. If you look up web-safe fonts, you can find these font groupings and just copy and paste them into your code. So when we click Save All and Run, you'll notice that our font changed from a serif to a sans-serif font. But we're going to add a couple more things to our body. We are going to change the background color of our web page. So we're going to write, just like you might think, background dash color, and add that colon. And then we are going to write a color that might look a little weird. We are going to start with a pound symbol, and it is going to be DE, DE, DE. This color is something called a hex code. A hex code tells you how much red, how much green, and how much blue to use. You won't see hex codes used all the time. You can just do something like this. But in this case, we want to use a very, very, very specific color, which is why we're using our hex codes. There are about 200 built-in colors in CSS, so red, green, blue, all of those colors that you're going to see out in the world normally. But then if you want to use something that's a little bit different, it has a little bit more green, it has a little bit more black, it's a little bit transparent, you have to use a different color code, and that's fine. You don't have to memorize it. Again, something that I think is really cool is using something like a color picker, so you can just do this on Google, and you can actually see, this has picked the color green for me. If I move this slider, it gives me, of course, this hex code, but it also gives me RGB, CMYK, HSV, HSL. You don't need to memorize these things. So we're going to use this hex code. This is going to be a light gray. Make sure you add your semicolon and click Save All and Run. So notice that the background of our website just got a little bit darker. And then finally, we are going to add margin. Now, before I add our margin and save it, I want to give you guys a couple seconds to think about where our margin is. So think about that box that's sitting on your porch. Is margin inside our box or outside our box? If you said outside, you are correct. Margin is everything that's outside of your box, or in the case of HTML, everything that's on the outside of your element. So for our margin, we are going to do a little bit of shorthand. 10px space 40px. Normally, you would only see one value after a property. You have your property and then one value. In this case, we have two values right next to each other. When you see this, you can know that it is shorthand for margin on the top and the bottom of our element and margin on the right and the left of our element. You might also sometimes see shorthand like this. In that case, think of it as going clockwise around your element. So this is top, right, bottom, left. So in this case, we're just going to do 10 pixels, 40 pixels. We're going to add our semicolon, click Save All and Run. And you'll notice that the margin on our body has gotten a little bit bigger. We've got a little bit more space on the side, a little bit more at the bottom, just a little bit more at the top. It's not super obvious, but those little details really add up when you're creating a website. All right, we are going to move down to our H1 and H2. So for me, this is on line 22. You'll also notice that these are right next to each other. So we don't have two separate selectors for our H1 and H2. That is because you can select multiple elements and apply all of the same styles to them just by separating them with a comma. So in here, we see this comment that says add rule for H1 and H2 here. So I'm going to hit enter. And we only have one rule that we are going to add. That is color, colon, teal, semicolon. So something that trips people up occasionally is, what does color actually do? Often people will think that color is going to change the background color. In this case, it is actually changing our font color. So you'll notice that Grand Circus Coffee, which is an H1, and Receipt, which is an H2, have become teal. So color actually targets the font color, not the background color. All right, so under this section that says ID selectors begin with a pound symbol. Oh, sorry, actually, we're gonna go all the way down to line 54. So where it says drinks, we see another comment that says add margin here. So you guys know where margin is. Inside or outside of our element? Take a minute to think about that. It is on the outside. So we're going to write margin, colon. And the margin that we're going to give our element with an ID, remember ID is that pound symbol, an ID of drinks. We're going to give it a margin of 4 pixels auto. So this is something you haven't seen before either. You probably recognize this from earlier, that 4 pixels is being applied to the top and the bottom of our element with an ID of drinks. But what does auto do? Think about that for a second. Make a guess in your mind. So auto actually centers all of your content. So if our drinks element is in the middle of our page and we add auto margin to both sides, the left and the right, it's going to give as much margin as necessary. So it's going to shrink it or it's going to increase it to give you as much margin as is necessary to center your element. So we're going to save that. Notice that our drinks just became centered. That's because this auto margin is at work, giving it as much margin as is necessary to center all of our elements. So we are going to scroll down to our checkout. So look for your selector selecting the element with an ID of checkout. For me, it is on line 42. Right under this ID selector, ID selectors begin with a pound symbol. Notice that it is completely grayed out. Some of you probably have a guess as to why, or why it's happening, but not why it is grayed out. The reason that it is grayed out, if you've guessed, is because right now it is actually commented out. So notice this /**. That's actually how we create comments in CSS. It's a little bit different than in HTML, but for CSS, when we comment out our code, we surround it with a /**. So just go ahead and remove that comment, that opening comment piece of code entirely. You'll notice that our code has become colored. So we've got kind of a purple color, yellows and oranges, but we still need to remove this closing comment piece of code right here at the end of padding. So let's click Save All and Run and see what happened. Wow, things got really bright. That is because we have unhidden all of these rules. And the first rule says background color magenta. So clearly our checkout box is bright magenta, but we are going to fix that shortly. So let's scroll down to line about 66, where our receipt selector is. And let's uncomment those pieces of code as well. So we've got that opening comment and closing comment. Click Save All and Run. And as you might have guessed, this receipt just popped up in the center of the page, just like happened with our checkout box, but we will fix that very shortly. So if you think back all the way to what feels like ages ago, when we added a class of hidden to 2 of our divs, we are going to put that into action right now. As you may guess, the elements that we added those classes of hidden to are these 2 divs that are front and center. So we are going to fix that right now by going up and looking for our selector right here on line 33. It says add class of hidden below. And we're going to do a little bit of magic right here. We're going to write display. Oops, sorry. We first have to select our elements with a class of hidden. So write period. Remember, period select classes and # select IDs. So we're going to select all elements with the class of hidden. Period hidden. Our opening and closing curly braces. And then that little piece of magic. Display, colon, none. Just like it sounds, it's going to hide those elements. But you might be thinking, don't we want to see those elements? We do, but not right now. And the way we are going to eventually re-show these elements is through JavaScript. So if you remember when I talked about web development in terms of the body, your HTML is the bones and your CSS is the skin and how everything looks. But the muscle, the one that does the lifting and does all of the magic per se, is your JavaScript. So let's click Save All and Run. And you'll notice that our 2 pieces of code, those 2 divs, that bright magenta checkout box and the bright white receipt box, are gone. This is just a little piece of magic that hides any elements. And then you can flip back and forth between the different types of display by using JavaScript. And that is all we're going to do for our CSS. So I'm going to close our CSS. We are going to go back to our slides and we are going to learn about JavaScript. All right. So JavaScript allows users to program more complex elements into a website, including interactive graphics, real-time updating information, and animated graphics. JavaScript puts the traditional code you may think of for apps and games into a website, making it more complex than the static code of HTML and CSS. In theory, HTML and CSS are code, and JavaScript is programming. The foundation of JavaScript is the variable. A variable is a named container that stores data values. For example, X might hold a number, temperature might hold hot, cold, or lukewarm, and size might hold small, medium, or large. A variable's primary purpose is to label and store data in memory for the web page to use and change, reuse at certain times, and make decisions. The first and only first time we use a variable in a script, we create it with the let keyword. Let sets up our variable and prevents us from making some common mistakes with the variable. There are two other ways to declare and initialize variables. We're not going to go over them today, so don't worry about them. Only think about let as the one way that you create variables in JavaScript. So when you write let and then the name of your variable, this is called declaring a variable. This is where you are giving it a name. So we're saying let price, and all that's happening right there is we are creating a variable called price. And a variable is just a container for data. So price can be whatever we want it to be. We are going to decide that. Another example is let drink. So by saying let, that's that keyword that tells our browser that this is a variable, and then we are naming our variable drink. And then we can put value into our variable, which is called initializing. So just a second ago, we declared our variable, and next we are initializing our variables. Until you initialize your variables, they have absolutely no value. So we have our let price, but then we've added a little bit more code. We're saying let price equals 0. If you don't even look at the code and you hear me say that, let price equals 0, that is exactly what it sounds like. I'm just saying that I want something called a price and I want it to be equal to 0. JavaScript is really cool because the way that it's written sounds a lot like the way you might talk in English. It's a little bit different. The syntax is not quite word for word what you would say in English, but it's very similar. It's sometimes easy to get hung up on the way things are supposed to be written, but forget that if you think big picture, it actually makes a lot of sense. So another example is let drink equal. This is kind of a curveball right here. This is called an empty string. What this is saying is let drink eventually be a word, but right now I don't know what word it is. And that will make a little bit more sense in just a minute. Functions help the computer run tasks. They block code together to run at a certain time, like when a user clicks, which is how we will use them today. This helps create reusable code that we'd otherwise have to write multiple times. Functions make our code simpler and make it easier to follow and read. I like to think of functions as just a machine, and our machine has an input and an output. You can put something inside of your machine that will get kind of changed and manipulated inside of your machine, and then it'll spit something out on the other end, but you don't have to. You don't have to put anything inside of your machine at all. You can just push that big red start button, and it will run itself, and it will spit something out on the other end. There's something called function headers and parameters. The function header just names our function so we can call it later. So just like we as people have names and we can call each other by name, and that's how we know to look at each other. When someone calls your name, we have to give our functions names. So in these instances, we've given our function a name of restart, which allows us to call it in our HTML. We've also given this function a name of checkout, which allows us to call it in our HTML. The function can also receive information in the form of parameters. This information can help drive the task the function is performing. So remember how I said that our functions are machines, and we can put something inside of our machine, and we can spit something out of our machine on the other end. Whatever you put inside of your machine, this is where parameters come into play. So think of this checkout as how we call our function. That's our function's name. And this choice is what we're putting inside of our machine. So when you press that big red start button or call your function, something is going to go on inside that manipulates that choice. A conditional is a piece of code that executes if a certain expression is true. So for example, again, JavaScript sounds a lot like it does in real life. A case where you would use a conditional in your day-to-day is, if it's raining, I should bring an umbrella. That's a conditional right there. You're saying, if this, then that. Another example is, if it's sunny, I should bring sunglasses. So conditionals do something that you do in your everyday life, whether or not you actually pay attention to it. If is the keyword that tells the computer to recognize a conditional. So thinking back to when we learned what variables were, we declare variables with the keyword let. That is what lets our computer know that what we are about to do is declare a variable. In this instance, if is the keyword that tells the computer, oh, there's a conditional coming up. This is an if-else statement, you might have heard it called. However, if a condition is not met, you can also have other conditions by using if, else, if. And if no conditions are true, you can have a condition called else. So over here, you see this giant piece of code. This is saying, if this, do this. Otherwise, if this, do this. Otherwise, do this. That is something that you think about all the time in your daily life. If I have pasta, I'm going to make spaghetti. Otherwise, if I have meat, I'm going to make spaghetti and meatballs. Otherwise, I'm going to get pizza for takeout. That is a conditional. There are also some built-in JavaScript functions. So remember that functions are those big machines that you can put something into and spit something out of. They are different than conditionals, which we just learned about. There are some built-in JavaScript functions that you don't have to write. You could just use them automatically. The first one is query selector, which is the easiest way to call back to an HTML element. This function will return the very first element in the document that matches the selector. So query selector is kind of like a pair of binoculars, and we're looking for the first element that matches what we're looking for. So if you like to watch birds, if you're a bird watcher, and you've got your binoculars and you're looking around and you finally see that red bird that you're looking for, you're only looking for the first one. You're not going to keep looking for red birds. You're just looking for that first red bird. That is what query selector does for us. So this is how you will see query selector written in the real world and in our code when we start working on it together. We are going to write document.querySelector, and then inside of those parentheses, we're going to put our element names. So you guys are familiar with element names, even if you don't remember them. An example would be the H1 or the P tag or an image tag. What this document is, though, something we haven't talked about quite yet, your document is your entire page. So when you are looking at a website, everything that you see on the page is your document. So we're saying to our browser, look at the whole document and look for this element and return to me the first one that matches it. This is used all the time in JavaScript. Another built-in function is something called parseInt. You're not going to use this very often, but it is something we're going to use today. ParseInt will search a string of characters for an integer and turn it into an integer so that it can be used for algebraic calculations. So if you're not a math person like I'm not, basically what this is saying is it's taking a word, so 2 as a word, and it's looking for a number value, and it's going to spit back a number instead of a word. There's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes. It's not quite that simple, but for terms of learning what is going on here, that's all it's doing. So let's go back to our script file in our CodePen project. And we are going to finish up by making our website functional. So you see right here, we have more comments and they look different. That's okay. Again, you don't need to memorize this stuff. There is a shortcut to writing comments, and that is Control / on your keyboard. So notice that when I click Control / it actually comments and uncomments out. So if you're thinking about getting into development and you're curious about it, but you're seeing all of these different types of code and different ways to write things, and you're a little overwhelmed by it, don't be. You can look all of this up on Google. You do not need to memorize it. And the more you write it, the more you're just going to memorize it. But you don't need to make a bunch of flashcards and remember all the ways to write comments and remember all of the font families. You don't need to do that. The main purpose of development is to be a critical thinker and to find creative ways to solve problems. It's not to memorize how to write code. So under here, we are going to add our variables. I'm going to hit enter once. We are going to write 2 variables. So before I write it out, think about how we declare a variable. How do we let our browser know that we are about to name a variable? Remember back to the first slide we talked about for JavaScript. There are 3 ways to declare a variable. We only learned one of them. And that word is something that you might use in English. That word is let. So we're going to say let price equals 0. So right here, this let keyword is just telling our browser that we are going to create a variable, and that variable is going to be named price. This equals sign is kind of continuing this variable. It's saying let price equal 0. So this is just declaring and initializing a variable. Declaring is this first part, initializing is the second part. Underneath our price variable, we are going to write one more variable, and that is going to be drink. So I'm going to let you guys see if you can type it out on your own. How do we declare a new variable? Again, it's that keyword let. So we're going to do let drink. And then to initialize our variable, just like before, it's an equal sign. And then we're going to do that empty string again that you guys saw earlier. It's just 2 quotation marks. And I'm going to put a space in between just so that you guys can see a little bit of the difference between these 2 quotation marks. It's totally fine to have a space in there. We're going to click Save All and Run, and nothing's going to happen because everything that we're doing is kind of on the back end side of the front end. This is not a back end language, but in terms of where we're working in our website, this is kind of on the back end. So nothing's going to happen. We're not going to see anything yet. You'll notice right here, we have our first function on line 5. It says function checkout choice. So this should look familiar because we saw some sample code in our slides that go over this. This function keyword tells our browser that we are about to write a function. This next piece is our function name. So recall, if we want to actually run our function or run our machine, we have to call it by its name. We can't just run up to it and press the button. We actually have to call it by its name. So we're naming our function checkout. And then right here inside of these parentheses, we actually have those parameters. So remember, our functions are big machines, and we can put something inside of that machine. Choice is what we're putting inside of that machine. So we're going to run a machine called checkout that takes in a choice. If you think about that, that makes complete sense in terms of what we are doing on our coffee shop project. Underneath this comment that says add the conditional below, we are going to start writing our conditional. When I write conditionals or if-else statements, I like to write the scaffolding before I actually fill it out. So that's what I'm going to do here. It's really easy when you are coding to get a little bit confused by what you're writing. So to make sure that we don't miss any quotation marks or parentheses or semicolons, we're going to start by writing the scaffolding or the skeleton of our if-else statement. So the first thing we're going to do, just like you might assume, is write if. That lets our browser know that what's about to come is a conditional. And then we're going to write parentheses. And then we're going to add our first curly braces. I'm going to go right after that closing curly brace and write else. And then I'm going to write if, because we're going to have three possibilities in our conditional. If, else if, else. And then we're going to do parentheses again. Opening and closing curly braces. Else if. Opening and closing curly braces. So if you are coding along, I'm going to give you just a little bit to get caught up because I know this can be a little bit confusing and the spacing might look a little bit weird to you if you've never done JavaScript. This highlighted section is what we are working on. Oops, sorry. Okay, we're going to start filling out our conditional. So inside of this if parentheses, we're going to write choice equals 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 latte. There's a lot going on right here. It's only 3 pieces of code, but there's a lot. So right now we're saying if choice equals latte, which makes sense if you say it out in English. This choice is a variable that we are taking in. So remember, we are taking something into our machine. So we're going to check inside of our machine whether or not the choice is latte. Then we have these 3 equal signs. When we use equal signs in JavaScript, that is a sign that we are comparing two things. So we are not reassigning the value of choice to be latte. We're actually just checking whether the choice is equal to latte. And then you'll lastly notice that we have latte inside of these quotation marks. So something that we don't get into in Intro to Coding is data types. And JavaScript is a great language because you don't have to worry too much about data types. But this word is surrounded by quotation marks because it is something called a string. So we are checking whether or not choice is latte. And then inside of our opening and closing curly brace is where we will put what is called the code block. So we are going to say drink equals latte, semicolon. And remember, drink is a variable that we declared and initialized up here. So what's happening right here is we are reassigning the value of drink to be equal to latte. And then under that, we are going to write price equals $4.29, semicolon. Don't forget that semicolon. So if we were to say this out in English, what we would be saying is, if the user's choice is a latte, the drink is a latte, and the price is $4.29. We are just finding a way to write something that we would do in the real world in code, which is all that programming is. Inside of our next else if, inside of those parentheses, we are going to write else if choice equals cappuccino, and make sure you spell this right or it won't work. So again, choice is what's going into our machine. These three equal signs are comparison operators. So they're checking whether choice is equal to cappuccino. Inside of our code block, remember a code block is what goes between an opening and closing curly brace. Inside of our code block, we're going to write, just like before, drink equals cappuccino with a semicolon, and price equals $4.79 with a semicolon. So to put this all together, we have a little bit more information to go off of. If the user's choice is a latte, the drink is a latte, and the price is $4.29. Otherwise, that's what this else if is actually saying is otherwise. Otherwise, if the choice is cappuccino, the drink is a cappuccino, and the price is $4.79. Otherwise, then that's where we're going to finish off. Else if choice equals iced dash coffee, drink equals iced coffee, and price equals $3.79. I'll give you guys a little bit of time to get caught up because this is a lot of code. This is the most code that we have written today. All right, before we finish up our JavaScript, I just want to point out a few more things that should look familiar from our slides on JavaScript. The first thing is this document.querySelector. So if you recall, document looks at our entire web page. So we're saying, look at our whole web page. And then querySelector is like those binoculars. So we're saying, look at our whole web page. And with your binoculars, look for the very first element that has an ID of checkout. So this should sound a little familiar. If we went into our HTML, which is where we always write IDs, we would see that one of our elements has an ID of checkout. Whoops. I'm just going to search for it. Right down here on line 26, we have a div, which again is just a division or some way to group a bunch of elements together. We have a div with an ID of checkout. So in our JavaScript, we're using our binoculars to look for that specific element. We also have another document.querySelector down here, which is looking for our element with an ID of checkout-image. There are a couple other things going on down here that we won't get too into because this is an intro course, like I said, but there's some really cool stuff going on here. And we have two other functions. So our second function is a receipt function. So remember to let our computer know that we are writing a function. We use that function keyword, and then we name our function. So this function's name is receipt. So when we call our functions, we call them by their name so that we know which one to call. And then our last function, we've got that function keyword right there to let our browser know that this is a function. And then we have that restart name. But we have one more thing to do to make our website interactive. So right now, you can click You can check out, but something's missing from our receipt. So let's go on down to receipt, this receipt function. And where it says add quantity and total calculation below, we are going to do just that. We are going to write quantity equals. So remember, we haven't gone too into this, but when you see a 3 equal sign, sorry, not 4, 3 equal signs, that is a comparison operator. So when you see 3 equal signs, you're comparing something on the right to something on the left. When you see that 1 equal sign, that is reassigning or assigning value to something. So right now, we see 1 equal sign right here. So we are going to give value to that quantity variable. So we're going to say quantity equals parse int. Remember that from a little bit earlier. Parse int is that built-in JavaScript function that will look at a string and spit out a number. To call a function, so remember we call functions by their names, but in order to call a function, we have to use these parentheses. And then we have to let the function or that machine know what we're putting inside of it. So our function's name is parse int, and we're putting something inside of our machine. And that something we are putting inside of our machine is the quantity itself. So we're calling our machine that is named parse int, and we're putting in the quantity, and we're spitting something out. And then we always end with a semicolon. And underneath that, we are going to declare another variable called total. So think to yourself, how do I declare a variable? What is that keyword that I use to declare a variable? That keyword is let. So we're going to do let total. And then to initialize our variable, or give it value, we use that equal sign. So let total equal. And if you think to yourself for just a second, how do you find the total of something that you buy at Starbucks? You probably take how many items you're buying and the cost of each of those items. So what is that actually doing? That is taking the price times the quantity. So in order to get our total, we are looking for the price and the quantity. So let's click Save All and Run. Let's open up our website again. And our website says to please choose a drink. So I'm going to click this iced coffee. I would like to buy 3 of them. And I am going to click Checkout. And then we have our receipt. So we're purchasing an iced coffee. We have 3 of them at $3.79 each, and this is our total. Now when we click Start Over, it's going to refresh that entire page. All of that interactivity is stuff that we did in JavaScript. So I think this is a really good example of how you could take a really simple website and build something extremely complex just with a few lines of code. So with that being said, we have one more survey for you guys. We want to know how we did. This is definitely an introductory course, so if you found this was fun and you want to do a little bit more, we do offer additional workshops. You can find those workshops at the link, koreancircus.co/workshops. I will have either Jessa or Patty put that link both to the survey and to our other workshops in the chat. But taking this survey is super important for us, just like you took that survey at the very beginning of class. This lets us know what worked, what didn't. Is it too fast-paced? Is there not enough information? Is there more that you want to learn specifically? And it helps us improve and tailor our workshops every time that we give them. Because like I said, we look at all of that feedback and we make those changes because you are our audience. We want this to be something valuable for you, and we want people to be excited about learning how to code and to want to take more classes. So with that being said, we have a code for you guys that is Growth 25. If you want to take $25 off of your next workshop, that is a great opportunity to both explore some more advanced workshops. So if you kind of liked this code that we did today and being able to see what you're coding and the interactivity, you can take that front-end course. Or if you want to learn a little bit more about back-end, there are 2 back-end workshops in Java and C#, which are great opportunities to learn a little bit more. But otherwise, here are a couple of resources if you want to continue learning on your own. Code Academy is absolutely one of my favorites. This is where I learned at the very beginning how to do HTML, CSS, and JavaScript before I even did the boot camp. They have tons of free classes. They do have a paid version, but they also have a trial period. I think it's 14 days. So if you want to take this on your own at a little bit of a slower pace, this is a really great place to start. It's very interactive, a lot like what we did today, where you are given some information and told to go off and try to figure it out on your own, which I personally think is the very best way to learn. Free Code Camp is another phenomenal resource. Just like it says in its name, it is free, so you don't have to pay anything to do it. Try C# is a great class if you want to dive into a backend language along with beginning Java. Those are located at codeschool.com and udemy.com. And you can copy and paste these right from the slides. Other than that, there are tons of free resources out there. Don't feel like you need to pay to learn how to be a developer any more than you are comfortable with. There are tons of free ways to learn. There are tons of YouTube tutorials out there. And obviously there are boot camps like Grand Circus, which for me was life-changing. It is a very personal decision to make a career change, but if it's something you're thinking about, I can't speak highly enough about taking that dive. So thank you guys so much for your time today. It was really great to have you all here. If you have any questions, we will leave the chat open for a little bit and we can answer those. But otherwise, have a great evening and rest of your week. Thank you, guys.